Now to a break in a mysterious murder case in Aspen, the first murder there in 12 years. A couple is in custody this morning, charged with killing longtime resident Nancy Pfister, who was found dead in her home last week.
When the closet door creaked open, the stench was the first thing that hit her. It wasn't perfume or cedar or the scent of luxury that usually filled Nancy Pfister's home on Buttermilk Mountain. It was rot, something sour and final, and behind the folds of linen and silk, wrapped tight in plastic and bedsheets, was the lifeless body of Aspen's most flamboyant socialite, beaten with a hammer, pierced through the chest with an axe, and left to decay where no one would find her. For 2 days, the house had been quiet, locked up, dark. And for 2 days, Nancy's closest friend, Kathy Carpenter, had told herself that maybe Nancy was just resting, jet-lagged from her trip to Australia. But when she finally stepped inside that bedroom closet, she didn't just find her friend, she walked into a mystery that would tear a mountain town in two. 3 people were arrested, 2 were set free, 1 man confessed, and then he took his own life. But the real question never died. Did Dr. William Trey Styler really act alone? Or did someone help him and walk away with a clean name and a $1 million life insurance payout? In a town of secrets, status, and silence, everyone had a reason to hate Nancy Pfister. But only one person swung the hammer. Unless he didn't. Before we take you deep into the icy corridors of Aspen's most haunting murder, please remember to subscribe, because this isn't just another crime story. It's a story about privilege, power, and the silence that money can't buy. And here, we don't just tell stories. We uncover the truths people would rather keep buried. So hit that button. Let's begin. To understand the storm that followed, you have to first understand Nancy Pfister, the woman Aspen couldn't ignore. She was born into wealth, raised on privilege, and lived like royalty in a town that already had its share of kings and queens. Her father, Art Pfister, helped build modern Aspen. He wasn't just a landowner, he was the man behind Buttermilk Mountain, turning its snowy slopes into one of Colorado's most exclusive playgrounds for the rich and famous. If her father was the architect of Aspen's elite, Nancy was its chosen heir. She didn't just walk into a room. She arrived, with her signature pearls, champagne in hand, and the unmistakable air of someone who never doubted they belonged. Nancy Pfister ruled the town's social circuit with a kind of reckless grace. She was the life of every party, and the reason those parties got louder after midnight. Those who knew her called her unpredictable, intoxicating, exhausting, and unforgettable. She could be warm, generous, and magnetic one moment, and distant, biting, or cruel the next. She slept with whomever she pleased, often inviting lovers into the very home where she raised her daughter and hosted dignitaries. According to those closest to her, it wasn't unusual for multiple men to pass through in the same week. She drank champagne before noon, popped pills without apology, and proudly defied any label that suggested she should live differently. Nancy wasn't just part of Aspen's wild scene, she was the scene. And yet, for all her indulgence, she wasn't aimless. Nancy knew exactly who she was, and perhaps more importantly, who wasn't welcome in her world. She had a sharp tongue and didn't hide her opinions. She once referred to people she disliked as trailer trash, and wasn't shy about saying so to their faces. She judged harshly, loved fiercely, and left behind either loyalty or loathing, rarely anything in between. Men adored her, women tolerated her, and when it came to her social circle, it wasn't uncommon to hear the word queen spoken with both reverence and resentment. Still, Nancy wasn't all pearls and privilege. She had her share of demons. Behind the bold laugh and big sunglasses were DUIs, addictions, and long stretches of self-destruction that had left cracks in her relationships and questions in her wake. But Aspen forgave her, again and again, because Nancy was Aspen, and no one wanted to imagine the town without her. In the fall of 2013, Nancy was in one of her in-between phases. She was planning a winter getaway to Australia and looking to rent out her 3-bedroom chalet tucked high on Buttermilk Mountain. She placed an ad in the Aspen Times, advertising the home to anyone looking for an elevated mountain experience. It didn't take long for someone to answer. That someone was Nancy Styler, a well-dressed horticulturist with a fading smile, and her husband, Dr. William Trey Styler, a retired physician with a once sharp mind now dimmed by neurological illness. They were new to Aspen, trying to start over, and completely unprepared for what it meant to live in Nancy Pfister's world. Nancy welcomed them in with her usual charm, gave them champagne, walked around in nothing but a robe and pearls, told them they could stay for free for the first month, help her pack, help her clean, help themselves to the good life. But beneath the hospitality, the friction had already begun, and Aspen, at least for Nancy Pfister, was about to become a very dangerous place to come home to. From the outside, it looked like a dream arrangement. 3 bedrooms, 3 baths, a luxury chalet nestled high on Buttermilk Mountain. A short drive from Aspen's bustling town center, but far enough to feel like its own world. The kind of place you imagine sipping coffee in front of a window filled with falling snow. Nancy Styler and her husband, Dr. Trey Styler, thought they had stumbled into the start of their second chance. But what began as a rental quickly turned into something far less defined. When the Stylers pulled up to the house for the first time, Nancy greeted them in a hotel bathrobe, pearls around her neck, champagne in hand, and nothing else. She invited them in like old friends, offering not just the chalet, but a month of free stay before she left, spa startup access to the house, and a casual ask that they help her pack. It was charming, unorthodox, and, soon enough, exhausting. Nancy Pfister didn't operate like a landlord. She was royalty in her own mind, and the Stylers were her live-in staff. She ordered, expected, demanded. According to Nancy Styler, once the money exchanged hands, she didn't become a host. She became a master. And everything changed. Nancy began parading around the house naked, often in front of Trey. She issued spontaneous requests, changed her mind without warning, and made cutting remarks about their appearance, their finances, their worth. She told others they were trailer trash, unfit for her home. She accused them of smelling like smoke and damaging her property. But she also smiled in photos, toasted them at dinner, let them believe, for a time, that they were part of her world. And so they stayed, bit their tongues, waited for her to leave for Australia. By the time Nancy boarded her flight, the Stylers were relieved. Finally, the house was theirs, and for a while, things were calm. But Aspen doesn't forget. And Nancy Pfister didn't stay gone. Weeks into their stay, the Stylers were hit with a series of sharp emails from across the ocean. Nancy accused them of ruining her house, refusing to pay utilities, damaging furniture, and making themselves far too comfortable. She demanded over $14,000 in damages and gave them just 4 days to leave before she returned. By then, their spa dream had stalled. The winter crowds had passed, and their finances were thinning fast. Still, they agreed to go. They packed what they could and moved into a modest motel in Basalt, Colorado, miles down the mountain. But they weren't gone completely. They returned to the house occasionally to collect the rest of their belongings. And on February 22nd, 2014, Nancy Pfister came home. She found them still lingering, still accessing the home, still taking their time. So she started locking the house behind her every day. She told friends she wanted them out completely, that she'd had enough. And this time, she meant it. But what Nancy didn't know, what no one knew, was that the quiet tension she'd left behind hadn't cooled. It had metastasized. Inside that house on Buttermilk Road, a storm was waiting. And it wasn't done with her yet. By Monday morning, Nancy Pfister wasn't answering calls. She had only just returned from Australia that weekend. Her 16-year-old son had been sent to stay with his father almost immediately after they landed. There was no explanation, just a phone call arranging it, and a quiet weekend that followed. Only one person stayed in the house with Nancy that weekend, Kathy Carpenter, her longtime assistant and trusted friend. According to Kathy, Nancy had seemed tired, jet-lagged, and disinterested in small talk. She went to bed early. Kathy left for work early Monday morning, slipping out while Nancy was still asleep. She didn't see or hear from her again. But Nancy was alive that morning, and then she wasn't. By Wednesday, Trey and Nancy Styler, now living in a small motel in Basalt, called Kathy out of the blue. They told her they had returned to Nancy's house briefly to collect the last of their things. They were officially out. The house was hers again. That same evening, Kathy returned to the chalet, not for Nancy, but to care for her dog. The front door was locked, the rooms eerily silent. There was no sign of struggle, no obvious mess, just an unsettling stillness. Then came the smell, rancid, lingering, and unmistakably wrong. Kathy followed it to the bedroom, and then to the closet. She used a skeleton key Nancy had given her long ago, turned the lock, and opened the door. Inside, she found a nightmare wrapped in linen. Nancy's body was folded, compressed, and stuffed behind hanging clothes. Her head was wrapped, her body covered in bed sheets and plastic. It looked like laundry, but it wasn't. Kathy dialed 911, frantic. But something about the call would later raise eyebrows. Her tone, her exact words, the timing. Investigators flagged it almost immediately. When police arrived, they flipped the mattress on Nancy's bed and discovered a pool of blood hidden beneath it. The scene had been carefully staged. The killer, or killers, had tried to erase what happened. They hadn't succeeded. The autopsy confirmed it. Nancy had been struck repeatedly in the face with a hammer, and then stabbed through the chest with an axe. There were no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle. She'd likely been asleep when it started. The blows were brutal and calculated, not chaotic, not rushed. Investigators believed the body had been moved, dragged, possibly by two people. Nancy was tall, solidly built, stiff from death, and the closet where she was found wasn't near the bed. It would have taken effort, deliberate effort, to get her there. There were no signs of forced entry, and that narrowed the list down fast. The Stylers had access. Kathy Carpenter had access, no one else. That night, all three would fall under a silent cloud of suspicion. And Aspen? Aspen fell quiet. In a town used to scandal, this was something else entirely. This wasn't a ski crash or a celebrity overdose. This was murder, in the home of one of its own. And the killer, or killers, had a key. Even before the autopsy was complete, Aspen police had doubts about the 911 call. Kathy Carpenter had sounded panicked, hysterical even. But when detectives replayed the audio, they began to pick it apart. Her words, her tone, the things she said she saw, and shouldn't have. For starters, the body had been wrapped tightly in multiple layers: sheets, plastic bags, clothing. From the closet door alone, there was no way to see it was a person unless you physically pulled back the layers. Kathy, however, claimed she saw Nancy as soon as she opened the door. She also insisted she hadn't touched anything, hadn't moved anything. That contradiction set off alarm bells. Then came the forensic timeline. Nancy Pfister had been dead for 2 full days before she was found. Her blood had soaked through the mattress. The killer had flipped it, dragged her body across the room, stashed her in the closet, and tried to erase what happened. Police didn't believe that was the work of one person. It looked like a 2-person job. And Kathy Carpenter was the last confirmed person to see Nancy alive. She had access to the house, she had the skeleton key, and now investigators were starting to think she had the motive. What complicated things further was what Kathy did after calling 911. The very next day, she accessed Nancy Pfister's safe deposit box, the same one where Nancy kept a $6,000 cash payment from the Stylers. Inside were also two valuable rings. Kathy removed both the cash and the jewelry. She told police it was for safekeeping. But detectives didn't see it that way. The woman who had just found her friend murdered in a closet had walked into a bank and emptied her valuables within 24 hours. Investigators began to map out a theory. What if Kathy had grown tired of being ordered around? What if she'd felt used, like the Stylers claimed they had? And what if, in the days before Nancy returned, a conversation had taken place? Something quiet. Something final. 3 weeks after the murder, Kathy Carpenter was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. She denied everything. The Stylers, meanwhile, were unraveling under pressure of their own. Nancy Styler had wasted no time throwing fuel on the fire. In her interview with detectives, she unloaded, calling Pfister a drunk, a liar, and a cruel woman hated by the community. She said Nancy treated her like a slave and treated Kathy the same way. It wasn't just character assassination. Prosecutors later used it to establish motive. 3 people who all had a reason to want Pfister gone. A growing bond through shared resentment. A triangle of dysfunction with no alibis. But one detail still held everyone's attention. The physical reality of the murder, the moving of the body, the flipping of the mattress, the wrapping, the dragging. It was hard to imagine any of them doing it alone, especially Trey Styler, whose health had deteriorated so much he could barely carry himself across a room. Yet somehow, someone had carried Nancy Pfister's body into that closet. As suspicion circled around all 3, police and prosecutors were left with an ugly question. Was this a solo act of rage, or a murder planned by 3 broken people who had finally reached their limit? As winter gave way to early spring, the town of Aspen was no longer whispering about the murder of Nancy Pfister. It was choosing sides. 3 people, all with motive, all with access, all under arrest, and none of them telling the same story. The Stylers were booked first, Trey and Nancy, arrested at dawn in their motel room in Basalt. Nancy Styler later claimed she thought she was dreaming when the officers knocked. Trey sat in stunned silence as the words "murder suspect" were spoken out loud. Then came Kathy Carpenter. Her arrest came 11 days later. What was once whispered as a possibility was now a headline. Aspen's beloved assistant, the woman who had cried on the 911 call, was being led away in handcuffs. And just like that, the case shifted from a single shocking murder to a collision of 3 collapsing lives, each one pointing fingers in different directions. From the moment she was arrested, Nancy Styler refused to protect her co-defendants. She told investigators that Pfister was volatile, manipulative, and deeply hated by nearly everyone close to her. She didn't shy away from expressing her own bitterness, calling Pfister a drunk, a narcissist, and a woman who treated everyone like garbage. But she didn't stop there. She pointed the finger directly at Kathy. Nancy claimed she and Kathy had argued in the days leading up to the murder, that there was tension between them, that she believed Kathy may have been the one to snap, get drunk, black out, and kill Nancy in a moment of rage. When asked if she had ever threatened Pfister herself, Nancy didn't deny it. "Yes," she admitted, "I said I wanted to kill her, but that doesn't mean I did it." Meanwhile, Kathy had already pointed the finger at the Stylers. Her story stayed consistent. Nancy Pfister had feared the Stylers. She'd called them ungrateful. She told Kathy she planned to kick them out permanently. Kathy told investigators she never saw this coming, but if someone had snapped, it wasn't her. And then there was Trey Styler, silent, tired, sick. While the women talked and accused, he kept his head down. His health was failing. He shuffled in court with a slow, uneven gait, His doctors described him as physically fragile, suffering from advanced neurological illness. Some believed he wasn't capable of violence at all. Others weren't so sure. That was the problem. Everyone had a theory. No one had a confession. The physical evidence told one story: blood, a hammer, pill bottles with Pfister's name, and a Jaguar registration card, all found in a public trash bin behind the Stylers motel. And then there was the key to the closet Nancy Pfister had been stuffed into, discovered outside the Stylers motel door. But the psychology told another story. Years of bitterness, insults, unpaid debts, and mutual resentment. Nancy Pfister had made enemies out of all three. Now, all three were standing on a sinking ship, hoping someone else would go down first. In court, their lawyers cast shadows in every direction. Maybe it was Kathy, maybe it was Nancy, maybe Trey had snapped, maybe it was all three, maybe it was none. What began as a search for a killer had become a legal standoff. And Aspen watched, wondering if the truth would ever fully surface. Because if one of them did it, the other two were letting them get away with it. It wasn't a breakthrough made in court. It wasn't even from a suspect. It came from a man collecting garbage. In early March 2014, just days after the Stylers and Kathy Carpenter were taken into custody, a Basalt City worker was going through a public trash bin behind a local motel. It was routine until it wasn't. Inside the bin, he spotted something strange. Not just household waste or tossed food wrappers, but a cluster of personal items that didn't belong there. An old hammer, bottles of prescription pills, and, most alarming of all, a document bearing the names Trey and Nancy Styler. The worker paused. Then he looked again. The hammer was stained with dried blood. The prescription bottles had Nancy Pfister's name printed clearly on the label. And the paperwork, a vehicle registration for a Jaguar X-Type, belonged to the Stylers. He called police immediately. When officers arrived, they confirmed what he'd found. The trash bin was located just 100 yards behind the motel, where the Stylers had been staying. And the items weren't just suspicious, they were explosive. The hammer was later confirmed to contain traces of Pfister's blood. The pill bottles had been taken from her home, likely after the murder. And in the eyes of investigators, it didn't just suggest guilt, it suggested a desperate attempt to bury it. But it didn't stop there. Just outside the motel room door, in plain sight, police found something even more chilling: a key. Not just any key. It was the owner's key to the bedroom closet where Nancy Pfister's body had been found. There was no plausible explanation. The Stylers had claimed they'd moved out. They'd said they were done. And yet here were her belongings, tossed like garbage behind their temporary home. Here was the very key that had unlocked the final resting place of a murdered woman, lying just feet from their motel door. It was the kind of evidence that didn't need interpretation. But the Stylers still denied everything. Trey claimed he had no idea how the items got there. Nancy said they'd left nothing behind. They stuck to their story, even as the walls closed in. Kathy Carpenter, too, insisted she had nothing to do with it. And despite the shocking evidence, the puzzle still didn't fully fit. Why toss the hammer and pills so close to where they were staying? Why leave the key, the most incriminating object of all, right outside the door? Prosecutors had theories, but they needed a confession. At this point, all three suspects were being held, awaiting what was shaping up to be one of the most sensational trials in Aspen history. Legal teams were scrambling, media outlets were circling, and townspeople who had once toasted champagne with Nancy Pfister were now watching her name get dragged through courtroom mud. But behind the scenes, something was shifting. Trey Styler, frail, quiet, and visibly deteriorating, was beginning to buckle under the pressure. And less than 2 weeks before his preliminary hearing, he asked to speak to investigators. He said he had something to say, something he couldn't hold in anymore. Because when the lies started crumbling and the trash failed to bury the truth, the only thing left to throw away was the silence. Nearly 2 weeks before the preliminary hearing was set to begin, the man at the center of Aspen's most talked about murder opened his mouth and took full responsibility. "I lost my mind," he began. "Or at least my rational mind. It was me. It was all me." The room fell still. For months, Trey had said nothing, let his wife take the heat, watched Kathy Carpenter get arrested, let the evidence mount in silence. But now, he was crumbling, and he didn't want anyone else to take the fall. In exchange for his confession, Trey Styler struck a deal. Nancy Styler and Kathy Carpenter would be released immediately. No charges, no future prosecution. He would take it all. What he described next chilled everyone in the room. On the morning of the murder, Trey said he slipped out of his motel room while Nancy was sleeping. He drove the Jaguar back up Buttermilk Mountain, up to the home he'd once hoped would be his fresh start. And in his own words, he went there to confront Nancy Pfister. Not to kill her. Not at first. He said she'd humiliated his wife, treated them like garbage, accused them of ruining her home, and now she wanted more. $14,000 in damages on top of everything they'd already lost. When he arrived at the house, it was quiet. The front door was unlocked. Nancy Pfister was asleep in her bed. He stood there, watching her, rage rising in his chest. He said all the bitterness, all the collapse of his life, his health, his marriage, erupted in that moment. He went downstairs and grabbed a hammer from the tools near the laundry. Then he found an axe and an orange extension cord. He brought it all back upstairs, and he attacked. He struck Nancy in the face repeatedly with the hammer while she slept. When she stirred, still alive, he drove the axe into her chest to finish the job. Then, coldly and methodically, he cleaned. He wrapped her body in her own bed sheets. He tied it with the extension cord. He placed her inside plastic trash bags. Then he dragged her body across the floor, flipped the blood-soaked mattress, and shoved her into the closet. After that, he said, he gathered some of her belongings, medication, cigarettes, to make it look like she'd simply gone somewhere. He drove back to the motel, undetected. He never told his wife. He never told anyone. And now, he said, it was time to stop lying. The confession hit Aspen like an avalanche. Nancy Styler and Kathy Carpenter were released from jail the very same day. Charges dropped, stories rewritten, headlines updated. But while the legal case had finally found its killer, the town itself hadn't found peace. Trey Styler's confession answered how Nancy Pfister died. But it couldn't answer what everyone still felt in their bones. Did he really act alone? Because if he didn't, someone just walked away with their hands clean. Could a 65-year-old man with a debilitating neurological disorder really carry out that entire murder alone? Could he strike with such force, flip a blood-soaked mattress, lift a full-grown woman, drag her body across a hardwood floor, and hide her in a closet without help? And even if he could, why throw the evidence in a dumpster right behind his own motel room? The math didn't add up, and Aspen wasn't buying it. Even former Sheriff Bob Broaddus, a local legend and longtime friend of the Pfister family, went on record with his doubts. He believed Nancy Styler was there, inside that house, when Nancy Pfister died. Not just emotionally involved, physically present. Broaddus pointed to cell phone records. At the time of the murder, Nancy Styler's phone was pinging from the Pfister home, the same moment Trey Styler claimed he had gone alone. When asked, Trey said his own phone was out of battery, so he'd taken Nancy's instead. To law enforcement, that didn't hold up. Why bring your sleeping wife's phone to commit a murder? Why risk tracking? But the confession was airtight. The plea deal had been signed. And legally, Nancy Styler could never be tried again. That didn't stop the gossip. Neighbors avoided her. Former friends crossed the street. Aspen had welcomed Nancy Styler as a newcomer months earlier. Now, she was the woman everyone believed had gotten away with murder, or, at the very least, helped cover one up. Nancy denied it all. In every interview, she insisted she knew nothing. That she hated Nancy Pfister, yes, but never wished her dead. That she was asleep in the motel when it happened. That Trey lied to her. And that she found out about the murder the same way everyone else did, through the news. But there were cracks in the story. When asked about her husband's detailed confession, how he had tied the body with cords, dragged it across the floor, flipped the mattress, Nancy said coldly, "I would have done a better job. That wasn't the work of a thinking mind." She called Aspen's investigators sloppy. She called the accusations against her a witch hunt. And months later, she published a book, Guilt by Matrimony. In it, she portrayed herself as the real victim. She accused Nancy Pfister of having borderline personality disorder, accused the police of corruption, described Trey Styler as a misunderstood man crushed by illness and stress. Aspen recoiled. The book was denounced as cruel and opportunistic. Local officials called it a hate letter to a woman who can't defend herself. Nancy Pfister's family, friends, and even Kathy Carpenter tried to have the book blocked from publication. They failed. In the eyes of the law, justice had been served. The confession was real. The sentence was final. But in Aspen, people weren't debating guilt or innocence anymore. They were debating something far more chilling. What kind of person walks free after standing that close to a hammer? In the summer of 2015, Dr. William Trey Styler was no longer making headlines. He was serving a life sentence at Arrowhead Correctional Facility in Canyon City, Colorado. Quiet, sick, forgotten. To most, he was just another number in the system, an old man wasting away behind bars. But Trey Styler had one more twist left to give. On August 6, 2015, a corrections officer found him dead in his cell. He had choked himself to death using pieces of a broken pen lodged into his own throat. There was no note, no last words, just a cold, quiet ending that left everyone asking again, why now? But days later, the picture began to shift. Trey Styler had been filing for divorce. The paperwork had just started. After nearly 30 years of marriage to Nancy Styler, he was pulling away, not just emotionally, but legally. And more than that, he had taken out a life insurance policy back in 1985, at the very beginning of their marriage, a policy worth over $1 million. There was no suicide clause, meaning that even though Trey had taken his own life, the insurance company was still liable. Nancy Styler, now living under her maiden name, Nancy Masson, collected the payout. She immediately filed for bankruptcy in Fall River, Massachusetts, protecting the money from creditors, at least temporarily. Publicly, she said little. Privately, she moved on. The man who claimed full responsibility for murder, who said he acted alone, who signed his name to the guilt, was gone. But his death didn't silence the doubts, because Trey Styler's final gift wasn't just money. It was permanent legal closure. The confession he made in exchange for his wife's freedom shielded her from ever being tried again. Double jeopardy protected her forever. The life insurance company paid. The court had its closure, and Nancy Styler vanished into a life no one could follow. Back in Aspen, the wounds never healed. Kathy Carpenter tried to rebuild, so did Nancy Pfister's children. Together, they petitioned to have Nancy's name added to the Aspen Snowmass Shrine of Friends, a local memorial trail that honored figures like John Denver and Molly Brown. The town approved. Her name was carved into the wood in 2016. But the whispers didn't stop. To this day, many believe Trey didn't act alone, that he wasn't physically capable of committing the murder, staging the scene, dragging the body, flipping the mattress, all without help. Even in his video confession, cold, clinical, detailed, there were holes. He paused often. struggled to describe movements, got lost in the sequencing. It was enough for the justice system, but not for Aspen. To them, it felt like a man covering for his wife, or a sick mind sacrificing itself to clean up the mess. Whatever it was, it didn't feel like justice. Trey Styler's death closed the legal file. Nancy Styler's payout insulated her from ruin. And Nancy Pfister? She remained in the closet, in the town's memory, in their shame, in their silence. Not just murdered, but erased. Nancy Pfister's name now rests quietly on the Snowmass Shrine, surrounded by other beloved locals. But when hikers stop and ask, who was she? They don't just hear about the parties or the pearls. They hear about the murder, about the hammer, about the night no one heard her scream. And Aspen remembers, because the snow may cover footprints, but it never hides the weight of silence. Trey confessed. Nancy vanished, and Kathy walked out of court without a single charge. But ask anyone in Aspen, and they'll tell you. Justice never really arrived. If this case shook you the way it shook us, like, comment and subscribe, because next time the secrets might be darker, the lies deeper, and the silence even more dangerous. Stay sharp, stay curious. We'll see you in the next one.